The engines grew louder, tearing through the mist like growls of an unseen beast. The compound stirred with unease, the soldiers shifting in formation, their weapons not yet drawn, but their hands restless against their sides. The colonel barked for order, his voice sharp, but he felt it too. The pull of danger rising across the horizon, his eyes fixed on the dark shape cutting through the fog. The woman stood at the edge of the field, her frame steady, her gaze unbroken. She did not flinch. She did not ask questions. She watched with the stillness of someone who already knew what was coming. The colonel saw it in her eyes, the recognition, the familiarity. And that unsettled him more than the engines themselves. He shouted at her, demanding if she knew what approached, demanding if she had brought this shadow upon them, but she did not answer. The vessel emerged fully from the mist, its hull dark, its shape foreign. Not the design of allies, not the design of any training craft it moved with. Precision across the water, silent, save for the hum of engines that seemed too refined, too deliberate. The soldiers whispered low, some muttering enemy, others saying unknown. The colonel silenced them with a glare, though his own chest burned with the same questions. The woman stepped forward, her feet carrying her closer to the shore. The colonel barked at her to stop, his hand raised, but she ignored him. Her pace steady, her eyes fixed on the vessel as though it had called her from the moment. She set foot in the compound. The colonel moved quickly, grabbing her arm, his grip firm, his voice cutting, demanding answers. She turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze, her eyes colder than stone, and said, "They are not here for you. They are here for me." Her words froze the air around them. The soldiers who overheard stared in shock, their whispers rising again. What did she mean? Who were they? Why would an unknown vessel come for her? The colonel tightened his grip, fury in his voice, demanding. Again, what she was hiding, demanding. Again, who she truly was. She pulled free with a force that surprised even him, her voice calm but heavy. "I told you my scars are not excuses, they are warnings." The vessel slowed as it neared the shore, its engines, cutting into silence, the sound of water lapping against its hull. The soldiers formed into ranks, their rifles raised, awaiting command. The colonel shouted for them to hold steady, his eyes never leaving the vessel. The hatch on its side hissed, releasing. A thin cloud of vapor, and the tension in the compound thickened, every breath drawn like a blade pulled across stone. The woman did not move back. She stepped closer, her body framed by the rising mist. Her eyes locked on the hatch as though she expected what would come through, as though she had seen it before. The soldiers watched her every move, their confusion bending into fear. Their colonel caught between stopping her and letting her stand against whatever ghost was about to emerge. The hatch opened slowly, a figure stepping into view, armored dark, the outline sharp and deliberate. The soldiers raised their weapons higher, their breaths catching in their throats, but the woman lifted a hand, not toward them, not in defense, but toward the figure, her voice steady, carrying across the wind. "You should not have come here." The colonel snapped his head toward her, demanding to know who it was, demanding to know why she spoke, as if she knew this shadow. But she ignored him, her focus locked on the figure that now stood fully revealed, tall, broad, moving with the weight of someone who carried the same kind of scars she bore. The figure paused at the edge of the hatch, its voice low and mechanical, carried through the mist. "You cannot run from what you were." The soldiers shivered, the colonel felt his chest pound, his questions colliding in his mind, but the woman did not flinch. She answered, her voice like iron. "I did not run. I survived." The figure stepped closer, its boots striking the ramp, its shadow stretching across the ground toward her, and in that moment the soldiers realized this was not an enemy. They knew this was something different, something hidden, something buried deep beneath the surface of wars they had never been told The colonel barked again, demanding answers, but his voice was drowned by the hum of more engines rising in the distance, more vessels cutting through the fog, their silhouettes multiplying against the horizon. His soldiers shifted uneasily, their rifles trembling in their hands, their discipline straining against the weight of the unknown. The woman turned to the colonel, her face calm but her words heavy. "They are not here for you. They are here to finish what was never supposed to exist." The colonel stared at her, his mind reeling, his pride drowned by the weight of what she had just said. The soldiers looked between them, their fear growing, their whispers spreading like wildfire. The first figure stepped fully onto the ground, the mist swirling around him, the sound of the other engines closing in. The woman straightened her shoulders, her voice rising clear across the compound. "You came for me, but I will not fall." And with those words, the air cracked with a silence so sharp it felt like the breath before a storm. And as the colonel stood frozen, his soldiers gripped their weapons, their hearts pounding, their eyes wide, because they all knew that whatever was about to unfold was not training, not routine, not war, as they understood it, but something far more dangerous. The compound bristled with tension. The soldiers locked in formation, their rifles raised, their fingers twitching against triggers, yet none dared to fire. The mist swirled around them, curling like smoke from an unseen fire. And the figures stepped down from the vessels one after another, their armor dark, their visors reflecting nothing, their movements precise. The colonel barked orders to hold, but even his voice carried cracks of doubt, as though he knew discipline alone could not stop what had come. The woman stood between the ranks and the advancing shadows, her body scarred yet steady her presence, pulling the eyes of every soldier away from their fear. She spoke low but clear. Her words meant for the figures, not the men behind her. "You think you ended me. You think scars are enough to silence the truth, but I am still here." The lead figure tilted his head, his voice carried through a device that distorted it into something inhuman. "We left you broken, we left you buried. You should not have risen again." The colonel felt his blood chill. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, their whispers sharp and broken. What did he mean? Buried. What did he mean? Left behind. The woman took another step forward, her eyes locked on the leader, her voice steady like stone. "The scars you gave me did not end me. They forged me." The colonel clenched his fists, his pride, his command, his certainty crumbling with every word for now. He saw what the soldiers saw. She was not here by chance. She was not a recruit. She was something carved out of battles they had never been told existed. The leader raised a hand, and the other armored figures fanned out, circling like predators closing on prey. The soldiers raised, their weapons higher, their discipline straining against the silence. The colonel shouted, to hold steady, his voice iron. Though his chest burned with uncertainty, the woman raised her hand too, signaling them not to fire, her eyes never leaving the figures, her voice cutting through the fog. "They do not fight like you do. They are not meant to be fought with lines and orders. They are meant to erase witnesses." The colonel felt the weight of her words pressing down like chains. His mind reeled at the thought of a hidden war fought in shadows with soldiers erased before their names were ever written. And as he looked at her scars, he realized they were not simply wounds. They were proof she had lived where no one else returned. The leader stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the ground, his distorted voice low enough only she and the colonel could hear. "You cannot keep it hidden forever. You cannot protect them from what we made you." She squared her shoulders, her voice steady. "I was not made by you. I was broken by you, and still I rose." The soldiers behind her shifted, some gripping their rifles so tightly their knuckles whitened, others whispering prayers under their breath. They had seen her conquer the grinder, but now they watched her stand unflinching before enemies. No training manual had prepared them for. The colonel felt his authority slipping away, replaced by something he could not control, something he had to either acknowledge or be destroyed by. The mist thickened the hum of more engines echoing beyond the horizon, as though the sea itself carried reinforcements. The colonel shouted for answers, demanding to know what they wanted, demanding to know why his compound was now a battlefield. She turned, her head slightly, her gaze steady on him, her voice sharp. "They do not want you. They want me, because I am the proof. They failed to erase." The colonel froze. His soldiers stared, their whispers rising again. She was the proof of something unspeakable. She was the scar that could not be buried, and suddenly her presence here no longer felt like chance, but inevitability. She had not come to test herself. She had come because she knew this day would arrive. The leader raised his weapon, not a rifle, but something unfamiliar, sleek and silent, its surface glowing faintly. The soldiers braced their rifles raised, ready to fire, but she spread her arms wide, her voice sharp and defiant. "If you came to finish me, then come and see if your creation can destroy what it could not control." The colonel shouted for his men to stand ready, his chest burning with rage, confusion, fear. Yet something else, something new. Respect. The soldiers held their weapons steady, their breaths caught in their throats, the mist closing tighter around them, the figures shifting into positions that promised violence. The woman's scars burned beneath the rising dawn, her chest rising steady, her eyes unblinking. She was no longer a mystery to the dawn broke cold and gray over the compound, the sound of waves crashing against distant rocks, mixing with the rustle of boots across gravel. The grinder loomed at the center of the training ground, a pitiless circuit of obstacles designed to crush even the strongest bodies and strip away whatever pride still lingered. The soldiers gathered in silence, their eyes fixed on the woman who now stood at its edge, her jacket folded neatly beside her, her scars hidden beneath a plain shirt, but still burned into the memory of every man who had seen them. The colonel stood tall, his expression hard, his voice sharp as he called the unit to attention. He told them this was not spectacle, this was not curiosity, this was proof, he reminded them, that the grinder had humbled men stronger than steel, that it had left warriors broken on their knees, and he said with cruel certainty that today it would do the same again. The recruits shifted uneasily, none daring to speak, yet their eyes betrayed the truth. They wanted to see what she was truly made of. She stepped forward into the grinder, her breath calm, her stride steady. The ground beneath her feet carried the weight of 1,000 failures, yet she walked as if none of them mattered. The first whistle blew and she launched into motion, her body pushing against each wall, each rope, each crawl, as though the scars across her back whispered strength into her limbs. The soldiers watched in silence, their usual jeers, absent, replaced by the sharp pull of awe. The colonel narrowed his eyes. His arms crossed, his jaw tight. He wanted to see her stumble, he wanted to see her break, because if she did not, his authority would bend with every step she took. She climbed the walls, her hands gripping the wood, her arms trembling, yet never giving way. She dropped into the sand and crawled through the mud, her scars grinding against grit, her face steady, her body relentless, every movement a defiance of his scorn. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours, the air thick with the sound of her breath and the pounding of her boots against the earth. The soldiers leaned forward, their fists clenched, some whispering under their breath, willing her to rise, others cursing softly, hoping she would fall. But no matter the wish, she pressed forward, her pace steady like a drumbeat that refused to die. The colonel shouted at her, demanding she move faster, demanding she push harder. His voice carried the sharp edge of command, but beneath it lingered something else, something he could not admit. Fear, because with every obstacle she conquered, the silence of his men grew heavier, and the doubt in their eyes grew sharper. He barked louder, his anger rising with every stride. She refused to surrender. She reached the ropes, her hands wrapping tight, her arms screaming with strain, but her eyes locked forward. She climbed with a steady rhythm, her scars stretching, her muscles burning. Yet she reached the top, her body bending over the beam, before she slid down the other side, landing with a force that drew gasps from the watching crowd. The colonel's fists clenched, his jaw grinding as she pressed forward without pause. The sun rose higher, the heat baking the ground, yet she pushed. Through sweat running down her face, dirt caking her skin, she carried the weight of silence on her shoulders and the unspoken disbelief of the men around her. The colonel barked again, telling her she had nothing to prove, telling her the grinder would crush her before it let her win. But his words fell flat against the sound of her boots driving forward. At the far end of the circuit, she faced the final wall, the tallest, the hardest, the one that had stopped countless men. Her breath came, heavy, her chest rising and falling like a storm. Yet she did not falter. She ran full speed at the wall, her body colliding with it, her fingers clawing for grip. She slipped once, dirt dragging beneath her nails, but she lunged again, her hands locking. Onto the ledge, her arms shaking violently as she pulled herself higher and higher. The soldiers held their breath, none daring to move, none daring to speak. The colonel shouted that she could not do it, that no one had climbed that wall after the grinder had broken them down, but she ignored him, her body shaking, her scars burning her breath. Ragged, she climbed inch by inch until finally she hauled herself over the top and rolled down the far side, landing in a heap of dust and sweat, but still breathing, still alive. The field erupted in whispers, the recruits staring wide-eyed at the impossible. The colonel froze, his voice caught, his authority slipping through his grasp like water. She had done what so many had failed to do. She had conquered the grinder in silence, and the scars that had once drawn his mockery now marked her as something untouchable. She rose to her feet, her chest heaving, her body trembling, yet her eyes steady. She looked straight at the colonel, her voice low, but strong, asking him if he still believed her scars were excuses. The soldiers turned their eyes to him, waiting for his reply, waiting to see what he would say in the face of the truth that now stood before him. The colonel's mouth opened, but no words came, only silence stretched across the ground, his pride burning, his authority bleeding, the soldiers watching him closer than they ever had before. And in that silence, the woman turned her head toward the horizon, her gaze sharpening as if something far beyond the grinder now pulled at her. And in that moment, the colonel realized her scars carried a story far darker than he had imagined, a story that was not finished, and that silence was only the beginning of something that none of them were ready to face. The compound simmered with whispers long after the grinder had ended. The soldiers who had once smirked at her behind their hands now carried questions too heavy to voice aloud. They sat in the mess hall, their trays untouched, their voices low, their eyes darting toward the woman who had walked past them and shattered every doubt they once held. She moved quietly, her steps steady, her shoulders unbowed, but the weight of their stares followed her wherever she went. The colonel sat in his office staring at the reports on his desk, yet his mind refused to rest. He replayed the image of her climbing the final wall, her body broken, yet unyielding. His pride demanded he dismiss it as luck, as defiance, as stubborn flesh, but his instinct whispered something darker, something older. He had seen scars before. He had seen wounds carved into men who had faced battles that never made the reports, and what lay across her back spoke of the same shadows. That night the barracks hummed. With tension, some of the men whispered that she had been part of black operations, a program buried so deep that not even their commanders spoke of it. Others claimed she was the last survivor of a mission erased from history, a mission so brutal that only ghosts returned. Their voices rose in fragments broken by fear and awe. and none dared to ask her directly, for her silence was heavier than any answer. The colonel called her to his quarters, the lamplight flickering across the walls, casting long shadows. She stood before him, her posture straight, her face unreadable. He demanded to know where the scars had come from, demanded to know who she really was. His voice carried command, but beneath it pulsed something rarer. Doubt she did not. Flinch she did not look away. She told him only that the scars were not his to understand. His fury burned through him, his pride screaming at the defiance in her voice. He told her that no soldier stood above command, that no recruit walked into his compound and carried secrets heavier than the weight of orders. He slammed his fist against the desk, demanding she speak, demanding she explain why she had come here at all. She met his rage with silence, until finally she said softly, "I came to see if I could still survive." The words unsettled him more than defiance would have. They carried the weight of truth spoken without fear, a confession that did not seek sympathy, but revealed a fracture deeper than bone. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Survival from what he demanded, but she only shook her head, her voice steady as stone. "I have lived through places you will never know." The colonel felt the air in the room grow thick, as though her words had dragged unseen ghosts into the space. He wanted to press harder, but something in her gaze froze him. Something in the way she held her silence told him that pushing further would bring truths he was not ready to hold. He dismissed her with a sharp command, though his chest still burned. With questions, she left his quarters and walked across the compound, her steps quiet, yet the shadows seemed to follow her. The soldiers watched her from their bunks, their whispers rising again. One of them swore he recognized her from a briefing. Years ago, a photo blurred and buried deep in classified files. Another insisted she was the lone survivor of an ambush overseas, an operation sealed and denied by officials, they argued, until silence swallowed them once more because none could prove. The ghosts that haunted her skin. The colonel lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, the sound of waves crashing outside his window. His pride torn, his certainty fractured. He told himself she was only one soldier. She was only flesh and bone, like the rest. But her scars told him otherwise, and her silence gnawed at him like an unanswered call. Every part of him screamed that she was not here by chance, that her arrival was more than coincidence. At dawn, he stepped outside the compound, the morning fog curling across the ground, and he saw her already there, standing alone at the far edge of the field, her gaze fixed on the horizon as though she waited for something. The sight unsettled him more than her scars, more than her silence, because in her stillness there was purpose. She was not training. She was not waiting for orders. She was watching, and whatever she waited for lay beyond his reach. The soldiers gathered behind him, whispering again, watching her from a... The morning sun bled through the thin clouds over the training field. The air carried the sharp sting of sweat and dust as soldiers lined up for another punishing round of physical training. The colonel marched across the field, his boots striking the ground with precision, his eyes scanning the line of recruits with a glare that cut through bone. He demanded discipline, he demanded perfection, and any sign of weakness was met with his sharp tongue that could slice deeper than steel. Among the line stood a young woman, her frame strong, but her movements slower than the rest. She pushed her body forward, each step forced, each breath pulled from somewhere deep inside her chest. Her muscles trembled under the weight of every command. Yet she did not quit. She never quit. Still her pace faltered and her arms strained, and the colonel noticed his stare fixed on her like a hawk circling prey. He barked her name, his voice booming across the field, demanding why she was falling behind, why she dared to move slower than the men beside her. His words dripped with mockery, his tone heavy with disdain. He accused her of making excuses, of not having the heart of a soldier. The men around her stiffened. Some hide smirks. Others shook their heads. The colonel always found someone to break, and today it was her. She stood there, chest heaving, sweat dripping down her brow, but her eyes steady. She told him softly that she had a reason, that there was an explanation. The colonel cut her off before. The words could settle his laugh, sharp and cruel. He told her that excuses were the language of cowards, that soldiers bled without complaint and fought without pause, that anyone who needed an excuse was already a failure before the first step was taken. The recruits shifted uneasily. The weight of his words heavy in the air. No one dared to defend her. No one dared to meet her eyes. The field seemed to close in around her, the sun hotter, the dust thicker, as if the world itself joined the colonel in pressing down on her. But she did not lower her head. She did not look away. She held his gaze even as his voice thundered against her like a storm breaking the horizon. The colonel stepped closer, his shadow falling over her frame. He demanded to know what excuse she thought would save her from his wrath. What words could erase her weakness? He told her that nothing she said would matter, that nothing she carried could justify falling behind in his eyes. There were no reasons, only results, and she had failed. His soldiers whispered behind him, their voices low, their curiosity sharp, waiting to see how she would respond. She drew in a long breath, her chest rising and falling like waves against rocks. Her hands tightened at her sides as, though gripping something invisible, she told him quietly again that she had a reason, a truth. He could not yet see, her voice calm but unshaken. The colonel sneered, calling her bluff, daring her to speak, daring her to claim some story that could change what his eyes already saw. Weakness. Nothing more. For a moment, silence held the field, broken only by the pounding of boots. In the distance, the sound of other soldiers pushing through drills. Her heart beat steady in her chest, though the weight of the colonel's mockery pressed like chains around her. She knew words would not change his mind. She knew no explanation would soften his scorn, and so she made her choice. Her fingers rose slowly to the zipper of her jacket. The colonel watched his, scowled, deepening. The soldiers around her leaned in their curiosity. Cutting through the tension, she pulled the zipper down, the sound, sharp in the quiet morning. The jacket fell from her shoulders, sliding away to the ground, and the air around her seemed to shift like a storm building at sea. The men who stood beside her fell silent, their eyes widening, their faces pale. The colonel himself froze, his voice caught in his throat, for across her back and arms ran deep scars, long jagged marks carved into flesh that told stories of battles, unspoken wounds that had been earned not in training fields, but in fire and chaos and blood. The scars glistened in the sunlight, stark and undeniable, each one a truth etched into her skin, a truth that no words could carry, a truth that no man in that field could dismiss. The colonel stared, his jaw tight, his mockery swallowed by the sight before him, and the soldiers who had once smirked stood rooted in silence. She did not flinch beneath their stares. She did not hide the scars. She let them see what she had carried beneath the jacket every day. She let them see the battles they had never known and the weight she bore in silence. She turned her gaze back to the colonel, her voice steady as stone, and asked again if he still wanted to call it an excuse. The field stood in silence, the colonel frozen between pride and shame, his soldiers holding their breath, waiting for his response, because they knew this moment was no longer about drills or weakness. It was about something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface of every scar. And as the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the ground, the colonel realized that the answer he gave her now would change not only her place in his command, but the faith of every soldier watching. And in his silence, a storm gathered that none of them were prepared for. The air hung heavy over the training ground, the silence pressing against the soldiers like a weight none of them could shake. The colonel stood frozen, his face hard as stone. Yet his eyes betrayed the tremor of something he had not expected. The scars across her body told a story that no excuse could match, each mark carved deep into flesh. A memory of fire, of metal, of pain that most men in that field could never imagine. The recruits shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between her steady frame and the colonel, who now seemed trapped in the moment. The man who mocked weakness stood face to face with a truth that no words could cover and no authority could erase. His pride pushed him to speak. Yet his voice caught at the back of his throat, because he knew that whatever excuse he had hurled at her had already been drowned by the silence of his men. One recruit whispered too loudly, asking where the scars had come from. Another hissed for him to be silent, but the question spread quickly through the ranks, their curiosity sharp as knives, each scar different, each scar deliberate, not the random marks of accident, but the signatures of battles fought in places unspoken. The colonel heard them murmuring, and his jaw tightened. His authority threatened to splinter with every word they dared to speak. He barked for silence, his voice cracking through the air like a whip. The soldiers snapped to attention, their whispers cut short. Yet the question remained in their eyes and in their hearts. The colonel turned back to her, demanding to know where the scars had come from, demanding to know if she thought parading her wounds would give her strength in his command. But even as he spoke, the sharpness of his voice wavered against the calm steel in her eyes. She met his gaze without flinching, her breath steady, her body unmoving. She told him softly that the scars were not excuses. They were reminders that every day she woke, she carried proof of what she had endured, and that no man, no colonel, no soldier would ever dismiss that truth. Her words were quiet, but they struck harder than any shout. The men felt it. The colonel felt it. And for the first time in years, he did not know how to answer. The field seemed to shift around them, the morning sun casting shadows long and sharp, as if the world itself waited for what would come next. The colonel clenched his fists, his pride roaring inside him, telling him to strike her down with words, with punishment, with force. Yet another voice rose within him, a voice he rarely heard, a voice that told him this woman was not ordinary and that her presence here carried a weight heavier than his rank. One of the senior recruits broke the silence, his voice low yet firm. He said she had earned her place. He said no one could look upon scars like those and call them weakness. The colonel snapped his glare toward him, ready to unleash his fury, but he saw the others shifting their eyes, nodding subtly, their loyalty torn between the man they served and the truth they had just witnessed. The colonel felt his grip on the field slipping like sand through his fingers, and he hated it more than anything. He had built his command on strength, on fear, on breaking those who faltered, and now this woman stood before him, breaking him instead with nothing more than silence and scars. He demanded again, his voice louder, "Where did you come from? What battles gave you those marks?" She stood tall, her shoulders square, her voice calm. "I do not speak of the places I have been," she said. "I do not need to tell stories to men who already doubt what they cannot. Understand, if you think scars are excuses, then you have never carried them long enough to know their weight." Her words cut deeper than any blade. Her scars glistened in the light like brands of survival. The soldiers stared at her. Their silence, no longer born of fear but of respect, of awe, even if they dared not speak it aloud. The colonel saw it too. He saw their eyes shifting, their loyalty bending not toward him but toward the truth etched into her flesh. And he knew that if he let this moment grow unchecked, his command would fracture. So he made his choice. His voice hard, his face carved with fury. He told her that scars meant nothing without proof of strength. In the present, he told her that if she wished to stand among them, she would face the grinder, the most brutal test of body and mind, a test that had broken men stronger than steel. He told her she would enter it at dawn and prove herself or walk away in shame. The soldiers shifted their weight, their hearts pounding. For they knew the grinder, they had seen it crush men into shadows of themselves. They had felt its weight on their own bones, and many had not finished it. The idea of her facing it with scars already carved into her flesh-thigh.